The recess was not scheduled. Nobody had requested it. Judge Frank Caprio called it himself, mid-hearing, which in 30 years of watching this courtroom was something the gallery had never seen him do. He set down the document he was holding, removed his glasses, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, and said with a quietness that was somehow louder than anything else in the room, "We're going to take 15 minutes. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Every person in that courtroom had just heard the same thing he had, and every person in that courtroom understood that what had just been said could not simply be absorbed and moved past without pause. The man at the respondents' table watched the judge stand and disappear through the side door. And then, in the specific way of people who have confused silence for agreement their entire lives, he turned to the gallery with a small, satisfied expression, as though the recess meant he was winning. He was not winning. He was 14 minutes away from the worst moment of his adult life. His name was Richard Carver, 53 years old, a landlord and self-described property developer who owned 11 residential units across Providence and who had arrived that morning in a pressed cream blazer, a pocket square, and the comfortable posture of a man accustomed to rooms where his presence sets the terms. He sat with one arm draped across the back of his chair, facing the bench at an angle that suggested he was participating in the proceedings rather than subject to them. Across the aisle, at a smaller table, sat a woman named Amara Ose-Bonsu, 37 years old, a home health aide who worked 60-hour weeks caring for the elderly, the mother of a 9-year-old daughter, and a tenant of Richard Carver's for 4 years, until 6 months ago when her heat stopped working in January, and she began withholding rent as permitted under Rhode Island tenant law, and Richard Carver filed for eviction. Amara wore a tan cardigan over a dark blouse. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She had brought a manila folder thick with documents, photographs, dates, written repair requests, medical records for her daughter, who had developed respiratory symptoms over the course of a winter spent in a 38-degree apartment. She had organized everything chronologically. She had done this alone without an attorney after working a 10-hour shift. If you've ever watched someone fight for basic dignity with nothing but the truth in a folder of receipts, you already know why this story needs to be told. Subscribe before this is over. Comment when you can't believe what you're hearing, because it gets worse before it gets just. The surface dispute was an eviction proceeding, non-payment of rent. Richard Carver's position was that Amara owed 5 months of back payment and needed to vacate. Amara's position was that she had withheld rent lawfully because the unit had been uninhabitable, that she had notified Carver in writing 17 times about the broken heating system, and that he had not only failed to repair it but had, in her documented account, told her via text message that she should wear more sweaters if she was cold. Judge Caprio had read the file before the proceedings began. He asked Richard Carver directly whether he had received the written repair requests. Richard Carver straightened his pocket square and said, "Your Honor, I receive a lot of correspondence from a lot of tenants. I can't be expected to personally respond to every complaint." He smiled when he said it, the reflexive smile of a man who has always found charm to be a sufficient substitute for accountability. "There are 17 documented requests here," Judge Caprio said, holding up Amara's folder. "Were you aware your tenant's daughter was sleeping in a 38-degree apartment?" And that's when Richard Carver said the thing that changed the temperature of the room forever. "Your Honor, with all due respect, if the apartment was truly that cold, she would have left. People have options. The fact that she stayed suggests it wasn't as bad as she's describing. Frankly, I think what we're really dealing with here is someone who found a convenient legal argument to avoid paying rent she simply didn't want to pay." He said it smoothly, confidently. He glanced at Amara when he finished, the way people glance at their evidence. The courtroom went silent, not the shifting, murmuring quiet of a room waiting for what comes next. The deep, sealed silence of a gallery that had just collectively held its breath. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff, a broad man who had stood in this room through hundreds of hearings, looked at the floor. Amara Ose-Bonsu did not move. She sat completely still, her hands flat on her folder, her jaw set with the particular dignity of someone who has had to be strong in rooms that gave them no reason to be. Judge Caprio looked at Richard Carver for a long moment. Then he said, "We're going to take 15 minutes, and left the bench. When he returned, something had shifted, not in the room's furniture or lighting, but in its atmosphere, the way a room changes when the person at the center of it has made a decision and arrived back carrying it. Judge Caprio sat, placed his hands on the bench, and turned to Richard Carver with the full, unwavering attention of a man who had spent 15 minutes deciding exactly what needed to be said and how. "Mr. Carver," he began, "I've been on this bench a long time, long enough to recognize a particular kind of argument, one that doesn't defend a position so much as relocate the blame. You just told this court that a woman who slept through a Providence winter in a broken apartment should have left if it was really that bad. You suggested her staying was evidence that she was lying." He paused. "Do you know what that argument requires you to believe? It requires you to believe that a single mother working 60 hours a week, with a 9-year-old daughter in school, with no housing voucher, no savings buffer, and no family in this city, had options. That leaving was simple, that she chose the cold." His voice did not rise. It never rose, but it filled every corner of that courtroom. The heat in that unit failed on January the 3rd. Her first written request was January the 4th. You responded to none of the 17 that followed. Her daughter has a medical record showing bronchitis acquired in February of this year. He picked up the folder. "She didn't stay because it wasn't cold, Mr. Carver. She stayed because she had nowhere to go, and you knew that, which is exactly why you didn't fix the heat." Richard Carver's arm had long since come off the back of his chair. He was sitting forward now, both elbows on the table, looking at his hands. Judge Caprio dismissed the eviction filing in its entirety. He found Richard Carver in violation of Rhode Island's implied warranty of habitability and referred the case to the state's Housing Code Enforcement Division for formal inspection of all 11 of his properties. He awarded Amara the right to remain in the unit rent-free for the duration of the enforcement process and directed that all repair requests submitted during the heating failure period be treated as formal complaints for the record. The housing inspection that followed found code violations in 7 of Carver's 11 units, inadequate heating, mold, structural issues in 2 properties, and a fire escape that had been non-functional for over 2 years. He was fined $74,000 in cumulative penalties. 3 additional tenants filed their own complaints in the months that followed. By the end of that year, Richard Carver had sold 4 of his properties under pressure and was facing a civil suit from 2 former tenants whose children had developed documented health complications. Amara Osei-Bonsu had her heat fixed within the week after a city inspector showed up unannounced with a clipboard and a court referral, and Richard Carver suddenly discovered he had a repair crew available after all. She still lives in that apartment. Her daughter's health improved by spring. The cream blazer and the pocket square turned out not to be armor. They never are. Justice doesn't need you to be loud. It needs you to be right and patient and willing to walk back into the room after 15 minutes with everything you need already decided. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it. Comment below and tell me what you thought when Richard Carver smiled at that gallery. Subscribe, because this channel is for Amara, for everyone who walked into a courtroom with a folder they organized alone at midnight after a 10-hour shift and refused to stop believing that the truth was enough. It was. It always is.